Me too. Got it. Okay. So we are just going to be having an open conversation with all of you today about LGBT culture in general. All of us here at GLIS are going to be sharing a bit about what that means to us specifically, and we'd also love to hear from all of you if you're comfortable sharing as much or as little as you please about your own experiences with that as well, and what culture means to you specifically. So yeah, we hope that you feel comfortable sharing in whatever way. You're welcome to use the chat. You're welcome to unmute, whatever you're most comfortable with. We appreciate anything you're willing to share. So I'm just going to go to our next slide if it works. No? Hello? Okay. There we go. So first, we just want to talk a bit about what does culture mean to you in the context of being part of the LGBTQ community. For all of us here at GLIS, and all of you in general and every member of the LGBTQ plus community, we all have very different experiences that shape our perception of the culture and how we experience that personally. And of course, a lot of things come into play with that. And the various intersections of our identities and our lives really shape exactly how we experience that. So of course, when we think about LGBTQ plus culture, we're not just thinking about how our gender identities and sexual orientations play into that, but we also have to keep in mind how other facets of our identity and lived experiences influence that, such as our race and nationality and, just our backgrounds in general, where geographically we're from, our education background, where we've grown up, our age even, pretty much any of our lived experiences play a role in how we experience culture. So now we're going to take a little bit of time for our GLIS staff to talk about and answer this question: what does culture mean to you? Is there anyone from our lovely staff that would like to go first? If not, I don't mind sharing first.
I posted in the chat box.
I completely agree, Robert, that a shared sense of how to act and how to portray who we are. There's a lot of culture, especially in the LGBTQ community, around holidays. I know a lot of the youth and I have talked about how important Halloween is to us as a queer and GNC folks, that it means a lot to be able to dress up in and be who you are. And a lot of fabulous drag gets started during the Halloween season as well. For me personally, culture has a lot to do with where I'm from. So I was originally raised in East Texas, which is very southern. And I'm from a very small town right on the border between Texas and Louisiana. So I didn't have anything like GLIS when I was a teenager. I didn't have support from an LGBTQ organization or any openly queer or trans friends when I was the age of most of our youth, 14, 15, 16. And so for me, in that space and place, it took much longer to be comfortable with who I was and to be comfortable expressing myself openly as a queer gender nonconforming person. And so it shaped a lot about how I think about the world and how I think about how LGBTQ folks are treated. And so when I was able to move away from that space, I realized that there were lots of folks who identified as LGBTQ who were doing amazing things in the world, and that you could be open and happy and in a loving relationship and have friends and people to support you. And so I think just from a geographical perspective, culturally, where you grow up and the town that you live in or the area of the country, or if you are not from the US, really shapes how you think about yourself and your identity as an LGBTQ person. Sue, do you want to share? I know you had some good stuff to share.
So for myself, culture growing up had to do with my national culture as well as my religious culture. I'm Irish Catholic, and my family is from South Buffalo. We moved to West Seneca, but it might as well have been South Buffalo. You know, the whole street was like, you know, one move. And so I grew up in this culture of everybody was the same. They were all Irish, they were all Catholic. You think the same, you act the same, and you assume everybody is the same. But of course, we know that that's not true. My biggest challenge during that time was I wasn't allowed to play with Protestants, because from Ireland, where our families were from, there was a great fear of anything that was different or outside that box that your culture put you into. So of course, you know, elementary school was Catholic. And even though I went to a public high school, it might as well have been Catholic, even though it was more like Italian, Polish, and Irish Catholic. And if anybody was something else different, they didn't talk about it. So put into that mix being gay. And the phrase at that time was homosexual, although gay was sort of the easing word. And nobody admitted to that. Nobody talked about that. That was very risky. But the heart wants what the heart wants. So that culture of hiding and being quiet and playing down your light and who you are, because otherwise you could be killed. You definitely would get beaten up, and you definitely would not be allowed to progress into other areas. And this, I'm talking about this, you know, this later 60s and 70s, because I'm 61 years old. But the cool part is that culture shifts. Culture is always a manifestation of the community and place and the norms of where you are now. Those were the norms. That was the grouping. Here today, I live in Amherst. I have 2 children. I am divorced, but I was married. Growing up, I never thought I was going to get married. I never thought that that was a possibility. I never thought that I could be all the things I became. And luckily, moving along with the culture and the norm shifts, I could do that. But I also can think of friends that could not do that. And that's why it's so important that when we talk about culture, we have to talk about the past and understand and learn from that, and also talk about where things can go for the future, because that is how we create healthy communities. So that's what culture means to me.
Thanks, Sue, for sharing that so much. I think it's really a rich experience to have all of us from varying parts of the country and from varying backgrounds and varying ages to really put together that scope of what LGBTQ culture is, because it's so vast and it's so independent to the individual as well. If anybody else would like to share, you can pop it in the chat. You can unmute yourself. We would love to hear from y'all what culture as an LGBTQ plus person means to you.
Don't mind me not knowing how Zoom PowerPoints work.
Since I can't do it, Allie, I have nothing to say. I praise you for just being able to put it on the screen, so it's all good.
Well, thank you. In the meantime, too, if any of our lovely attendees are still thinking of how they would respond to this question, I don't mind sharing a little bit about what culture means to me and just my experiences in general. As Galina said, we do have a pretty wide range of backgrounds and experiences here right now, where all of our experiences and perceptions of the culture mean different things. For me personally, I am about to be 23. I grew up, you know, in a suburb on Long Island, and I went to Catholic school pretty much all my life until I went to college. In high school, I went to an all-girls Catholic school. So that, I think, shaped a lot of, you know, just my own understanding of my identity and the LGBTQ community in general. So, you know, given that that was my upbringing, I really did not have much exposure to the LGBTQ plus community at all. In my personal life, I had some family members that were out, but because, much of my family was, Catholic, we just really didn't talk about it. And it was sort of, don't ask, don't tell, just keep that to yourself. That's private. And growing up in Catholic school, that was the message that was sent as well. That was, being LGBTQ plus was literally never mentioned once. In my education, and then going into high school as well, we had our health classes and our theology classes, and those identities did get brought up into conversation, but always in a context of, well, if you identify that way, you're just confused or you're not following, God's path the way that you're intended, and you need to find your way back to that. And there was never room to have open conversations just about the community in general, and especially not to exist as an LGBTQ plus person in that environment in a way where you felt like you would be accepted and supported. So for me, I think a lot of my experiences and finding my own way in the community was me turning to online environments. And I am curious to hear from our attendees if that's something that is, something that you're experiencing as well. But because I didn't have these safe spaces growing up, I turned to places like Tumblr and Twitter. And that's where I found community, because it wasn't until high school that I even had other friends that identified as queer. And even then, we were all sort of fearful of admitting that even to each other, because we were in at least a school environment where that was so frowned upon. So to me, that was my biggest source of support, going to these online communities and finding other people that identified similarly to myself. And this was at a time too where I wasn't quite sure about labels. And I think, the era that I grew up in on Tumblr and things like that, there was such a big emphasis on subscribing to specific labels and, going through every label you could even imagine. And there being a really heavy emphasis on finding which one works for you. And I think that now at this point in time, there is a lot less emphasis placed on choosing one specific label. And I think, just from what I've seen and experienced myself, we are kind of more aware that, your sexuality and your gender identity are things that are fluid, and you don't necessarily have to find one specific label or term that describes that perfectly, because that is your own experience and you don't owe anybody else a label. You don't owe anyone else an explanation of your identity. You own that yourself. So I think that's a bit of a change that I've seen within the community, just even in the last few years. Even myself, I identify as an agender lesbian, and those are both terms that I would have never thought to claim when I was in high school, or before then, for a lot of reasons. But I think it's because during that time, I just was still in this environment where your identity would be so heavily scrutinized if you were out in any way, and especially if you picked these sort of labels. So I think now we at GLIS, at least, this is my experience and what I've seen since I started interning here, in August, I think we have more of a culture that is just very accepting and welcoming of all people in our community, no matter how you identify, no matter what stage you are in, determining your own identity and where you fall in the community. We are here for all of you through every step of that process. And I think that is where I personally would like the culture of the entire LGBTQ community to lean more towards, where there's less, gatekeeping and emphasis placed on choosing a specific label or falling into a very specific box, where we just are here to support each other no matter what. Because even though we have all grown up in our own different shared experiences, and none of us have the same exact experience, we still have these certain common shared experiences as members of the LGBTQ community that we can connect on, and where we want to stand together and support and uplift one another. So that's just my take. I would still love to hear from, anyone else who's attending today. If you can relate to anything that any of us have said, if you have any more insight on what exactly culture means to you in this context, please feel free to share.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Allie. We had some folks chatting in the chat box while you were sharing, so I just wanted to share a couple of things. Someone commented that culture to them has a lot to do with the art and the media that the population consumes, and the holidays that are cherished, the foods that are eaten, and how people within the community act and interact with each other. And I think that that's so key. I think really highlighting especially art and media and what is valued in society is a huge part of how culture gets created. And on the flip side of that, right, it's what we don't see, and it's what isn't necessarily valued. So like you mentioned, holidays, there are a lot of Judeo-Christian holidays that are valued in society widely, but some holidays that are practiced within other religious or cultural traditions may not get as much exposure, at least in the Western world. Art and media and things of that nature that obviously portray a lot of cisgender and heterosexual folks in relationships. So on the opposite side of that, like what Allie was talking about, is then spaces and places get created for the opposing, I don't want to say opposing, but the differing viewpoints that are not part of that dominant narrative. So like Tumblr is a really good example. I know y'all, Tumblr has made a resurgence for our youth recently. And it's a really good example of a space where queer art and queer stories are being shared. When I was a teenager, it was like fanfic. People were always changing heteronormative storylines to queer and trans storylines, and creating that representation for ourselves is, I think, a huge part of LGBTQ culture. So thank you so much for sharing that and bringing that up. And then we had another comment that someone still does not know a lot about LGBTQ culture, pretty new to being a part of it, and that their family is one of those families that doesn't necessarily discuss it. And so they haven't shared a lot about their personal identity yet. And that is so relatable, I think, for all of us here, that as you grow as a young LGBTQ plus person, it can be really difficult because of all the reasons that we've laid out to find that culture and to find that community and learn about yourself. And that, I think, is the mission of all of us here at GLIS, is to give you peer support and to give you role models and to give you people who've been through what you're going through. So I really, really appreciate you bringing up that, because I think actually the fact that you don't know a lot about LGBTQ plus culture is part of LGBTQ plus culture as a young person, because the spaces and places that we see ourselves represented are still very marginalized. So I think you've hit a really, really important point there. Yeah, thank you so much to all of our participants who shared. We really appreciate hearing your stories. Now, if we want to go ahead and move on to the next slide, Allie. So Sue, if you want to share a little bit about what you were thinking in context of this fantastic meme that I found, which is labels are for soup cans. They are not for human beings.
I loved when Galina shared this, because in growing up, the aspect of culture was about where you hung your hat of choice. There wasn't a lot. You were gay or homosexual. And in time that went from gay to lesbian. And lesbian, people didn't like to embrace that word. It sounded, there's a comedian, Leah Deloria, and she does this comedy routine for, she's like, honey, the refrigerator's on the fritz, better call the lesbian. And it's making fun because it sounds like a clinical term. And now though, here's this whole list of terminology, and it is by no means exhaustive. But what it does is it just shows the variety and the expansiveness that the identity culture within LGBTQ, how it has gone on and continues to, as it should, because it's about that expansion. I wanted to just piggyback on something Axel said, though, if I can. Axel was talking about that culture is about art and media, and then was talking about foods and rituals. And I love that because there is an intersectionality between those things that, you know, as you're going through school, you learn about culture, you're learning about cultures of other countries and other people. And, you know, LGBTQ people are as much of that. And there are foods. I mean, it was always that lesbians had potlucks. That was the cultural food component. It's a stereotype, but it's, you know, as we look at this, there are some elements that go with that. And Galina was talking about even some of the religious, and I'll just tell you very quickly, my children are Jewish, and of course we do Jewish rituals. And this year during the Passover, we have what's called a Seder plate. It's part of the family dinner ritual. And in certain homes, they put an orange on the Seder plate. And they do this because it is a representation of LGBTQ, BIPOC, marginalized individuals. And it came from a woman who was at a speech by a very famous rabbi and asked him, you know, is there a place for women on the bima? For those of a Christian or Catholic, that's like the same as like an altar. And the gentleman said, there's as much a place for a woman on the bima as there is a slice of bread on the Passover Seder plate. Henceforth, many people now put an orange. And so that becomes part of a culture as well. My kids have never known any different, that there's always an orange on the Seder plate. And so every family can take the rituals, whether it's the food or the music, and find a way to intersect that with aspects that hold up LGBTQ images or LGBTQ identities. Thanks, Galina.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Sue. I love that story about the Seder plate. I remember you posted that on one of our social media, and I read it, and I had not heard of that tradition. And I just think that's amazing to see how different religious and cultural traditions are making those spaces and creating those affirming and loving and safe spaces for folks. So thanks so much for sharing that. For me personally, and I know this is something that I've talked to some of our youth about, labels are something that I have always struggled with. When I first came out, I identified as pansexual because I felt like that was the closest thing to the way that I was feeling at that time. And then as I got to know more of myself, as I talked with other queer and trans folks, and I really got to understand a lot more about what identity means as an individual, my perception of my own identity evolved. And I think that this is not an uncommon thing that happens within our community. And a lot of times, especially youth, are shamed for supposedly changing their identity or using a different term or using a different word for the way that they're identifying. And I just want to say that is a perfectly normal, understandable, and totally acceptable part of the process of finding out who you are as a person. And we have to remember that these labels are created, again, under that heteronormative, cisgender, heterosexual banner to describe folks who don't fit under that banner. So essentially it would be like if I was trying to describe a word to you in English that was specific to ancient Greek and there was no way to translate that word. That's how I like to think of it. So that's where we get like a lot of the umbrella term labels. Allie and I talked a little bit about that in our workshop, where we talked about lesbian culture and that lesbian is evolving as an umbrella term, including bi and pan people, including he, him lesbians and non-binary lesbians. So I just wanted to say that I completely understand the evolvement of your own personal way that you are using labels, and it's completely not only acceptable and understandable, but very common within the LGBTQ community and very valid. So by no means, way, shape, or form do you ever feel that you have to label yourself, or do you ever feel that once you have started to label yourself or chosen a label that you have to continue using that?
So for myself, I think that labels are pretty useless. I mean, when you think of yourself, you really don't need to use any labels because you look at yourself from the inside out. But sometimes if you're looking to find other people, you may label yourself. So, I label myself as gay so that I could meet other gay men for the time. I think these days I am re-embracing the word queer, which we hated when we were young, and people, used it as a severe slur, but there's power sometimes in reclaiming labels. And so I've reclaimed the label queer for both my sexuality and for my gender. So a lot of times, and I love the confusion that people will say, like, well, what gender do you consider? Well, queer. Well, what's your sexuality? Well, queer. And it can confuse people, and I'm enjoying confusing people these days, I guess. So never be afraid to even confound or make people, question a little more about what's going on. That's what I say.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Robert. I think you hit on such an important point, which is that, first of all, the point of reclaiming and understanding where words and labels come from and how they've been used historically is super, super important in the LGBTQ community. And especially as we're sitting here, talking about all the different sort of eras that we were raised in and the different spaces and places we were raised in, certain words mean very different things to different LGBTQ people. And like the word, like you said, the word queer historically has been used as a slur term, and a lot of younger folks using the term queer need to be respectful of that and remember that it is a word that's been reclaimed, and it is a word that our elders fought to reclaim. So I really appreciate you sharing that. And I love that you love confusing people, because that's like one of the funnest parts for me about being an LGBTQ plus person too. And then I just wanted to say about identifying as gay so that you can find community. That again is part of the label, right? So sometimes labels can actually be very important in helping you find community and helping you find spaces where you feel affirmed and accepted. So I don't want anyone to think that we're saying that labels are necessarily always useless for every single person. That sometimes using a word that's been reclaimed for yourself, or using a word that's helping you find community, can be very helpful. I think just in general, putting blanket labels or blanket identities over people and not recognizing the individual significance, that's where it's problematic.
I think you're right, Galina. I know growing up, there was so much pressure to conform. And I remember in the early 70s and going out, everyone was sporty or androgynous. And that was the way of fitting into that then gay culture, which was basically softball fields and bars. Not necessarily the healthiest of places. But that was where if there was culture to be had, that was it. And then, of course, as life expands and it becomes, just as Axel talked about, like art and music and other components, food, as well as the expansion of representation, as we've seen on television, Now today, you guys can watch television and see RuPaul's Drag Race or the Queer Eye, or see characters that are infused into television shows, but being LGBTQ is not their big storyline. It's just a part of who that character is. Whereas in my era, there was nobody on television who was gay. There were caricatures. There was a famous comedian named Flip Wilson, a Black gentleman who used to do this sort of drag. Was it Ernestine? I'm not going to get the character. And everyone would laugh, and it was silly. They were making fun of, but also laughing. But it was the beginning of the infusion of some cultural components to see people in a different way. And so again, for young people, was there something in there?
Geraldine.
Geraldine, thank you. And so again, your ability to look at who you are, that's the important part when we talk about a label. And that can be fluid and flexible. Like I said, coming out, you looked at yourself in one way during my era. Now, so many different things. I identify as a butch lesbian. Now, back then I would never have. Why? Because I didn't even know those words or what that meant. But I knew that certain words didn't quite fit with where I felt my identity was. And hopefully you're going through some of that, and you've got more words and you've got more vocabulary than was had then. And hopefully that helps you to move towards an authenticness. So let's hear more about what you guys want to say about labels and identities and phrases and words. I'll make that. Are there any phrases or words that are out there that you get offended by, that you don't like when you hear it, or it causes a fear or a concern when you hear either the media or even just in school or community that somebody uses a word? You can type if you'd rather instead of talking. I know for me, as we were talking, the word queer. If I heard that word, my face turned red, my ears turned red. I prayed to God I wasn't the target of whoever was yelling that. Yep, somebody just wrote they hate fag. And I usually, when I would hear these words, I usually knew something bad was going to happen to somebody. If someone was shouting at queer, fag, bull dyke, no lovingness in those phrases. Now today, people will embrace some of those words. Okay, I see Axel, the context. Right, the same way that like we have a dyke march every year and everyone embraces that word. But me growing up, I had bottles thrown at me walking down the street from people yelling dyke. So again, context, where you are, what's happening. Axel, can you tell me more about context for you in terms of places or areas where a word could have a good meaning, or then maybe a bad meaning, or maybe a fearful meaning? And anyone else can respond to that too. I know we've got many other people here. Anyone who wants to chime in, please do. Okay, thanks, Luna. Wow, that's a great answer. And definitely I can see the journey and the exploring in that. Thank you so much for sharing that. If you want to talk, Luna had written into the chat, and so everyone can read Luna's comments there in terms of labels and identities. And yeah, just sometimes it's easier to say, yeah, because out in the world, people don't always understand some of the things. I mean, you're going to find, especially when you're dealing with parents, you're way out here and they're still over here trying to figure out from their root of understanding. So that can make it real different when there's a wide gap in understanding and labels and words. And sometimes I'm still catching up. Even though I'm in the LGBT community, I sometimes have to catch up with new phrases or words that young people or others are using. That's why phones are good. I can just Google it and look it up while they're talking and go, okay.
Thank you so much, Axel, for sharing that. I I believe for me as well, I think from the generation, especially, like I said, I was a preteen in the late 90s, early 2000s, around there. And often that sounds so gay or you're so gay was used in a very, very derogatory term. And I know that it's still used that way in a lot of schools and other spaces. And that when we use that term for ourselves or when we hear it from our friends who are LGBTQ plus or allies, we know it's an affirming term. But when someone uses it like, oh, you're just being gay, or in replacement of a very bad or a very stereotypical term, that just immediately makes us feel really uncomfortable. So I completely relate to that. If anybody has a few other, oh, yep. Yeah, I think Robert has shared about some terms that they feel that made them extremely uncomfortable that have to do with crossing over or misunderstanding femme gender expression and femme presentation with necessarily being a gay man or having a certain label. And I think that's completely understandable that in our society, because we're binary, we automatically want to put people in the masculine, feminine boxes, and we don't understand that there's any sort of flexibility or crossover there. And that your gender identity and your sexual orientation can be things that are intertwined, yes, but can be things that are very independent of one another and don't necessarily have anything to do with each other either.
I wanted to talk, Luna Rose, thank you so much. I hear that actually at the middle school where my son goes to. And of course, when I hear them say that, like, it has embarrassed my son when, you know, the guys are walking out of school, no homo, no gay. I'll be like, I'm gay. And of course he's like, would you just shut up? Because I want to disperse that. When I was in high school, I was sharing a story with Galina and Allie that a group of girls got together and created a group. They called it WANG, W-A-N-G. We are not gay. And especially in sports, there was so much pressure to live and be representing of a straight life. The joke of that is that many of the girls who are part of that club are now women, grown up and married to their female partners. I know some of them socially, but that was a survival technique. It's almost like a shield. And I watch some of these young men and I just think to myself, yeah, I would just wonder how many of them are going through that as well. It's not safe or it doesn't feel safe. I even see coaches push this. And that's something we try to do at GLIS is to help and say, nope, we gotta stop that, you know? And the fact that gay athletes are coming out more and more, and that teams such as last weekend, and Robert can speak to this, the Sabres had a pride game with the Pittsburgh Penguins, and it was all about gays, LGBTQ involved with athletes. Do stuff like that, yeah, and then joke, yeah. Yeah, you're going to see so many shields. I'm reading what Axel has written, and that's hard. And Robert said the Sabres lost in the Pride game, but I think more so than anywhere is sports, where there's still such a culture of heterosexism, and it's little by little. But it's hard if you're a gay athlete. I lettered in 4 sports, and to be able to achieve or work at those levels meant you had to give up some parts of yourself. And you had to kind of figure out what was more important, which I don't think anyone should ever have to figure that out. It should all be important. And if I'm reading what you're saying, Luna, that stuff still goes on. And so that just means our work still has to be going on too. But thanks for holding that up, because yeah, that's a big issue.
Yeah, I want to address something that Axel said. I get confused by very homophobic people, but then act like they are gay as a joke. So I always say that I was born at the end of the age of denial. So before kind of the 1960s in the United States, there was this incredible denial about whether or not like gay people really existed. It was some kind of a myth. It was like, oh, come on, that stuff doesn't go on and those people don't exist. And then in the 1960s, that kind of reversed itself and it started becoming a reality and it became known. And then there were these horrible things on the news about the gay menace. In fact, the reporters that did it later had to apologize and felt horrible about what they did, and then explain that they completely learned and relearned and changed their position on the subject of homosexuality. But as people started thinking about it, they got really scared about the idea, oh, it does exist. Oh, that's really scary. But then something else happens in society and suddenly it starts to become accepted and it enters into humor. And so I remember seeing even things on Laugh-In, which was an old comedy show. And Burt Reynolds, if you know who that is, depicted a gay guy from San Francisco, and he wore a purse over his shoulder and he kind of sashayed around. So they were making fun of gay people, and of course people who.
Oh no, I think Robert froze on us for a minute. So we'll see if hopefully their connection will come back. But we have a few minutes left. So I just want to move us on to the last slide that we have here, which is just some more in-depth questions that we had for y'all. A lot of these we've kind of discussed a little bit already, but please feel free to continue sharing in the chat. I just want to thank y'all for being so engaged in this. This is such an important conversation. And I know from personal experience, as do all of us here, it is not easy, especially to share about how you are treated in spaces that we have to go every day. We don't have a choice to go to the grocery store. We don't have a choice to go to the DMV. Y'all don't have a choice but to go to high school or middle school. And I know how difficult it is to share about that. And so I just really want to thank y'all for feeling safe enough to do that with us. So the last couple questions that we had, just to think a little bit deeper into this issue, was how do your school experiences influence your identity? What are some things you feel strongly represent who you are? This can be anything that we've been talking about, where you're from, maybe who your friends are, maybe how you relate to your family or what your family structure looks like. And then how does your city, town, or village talk about LGBTQ plus culture, and how has that impacted you? So if anybody feels comfortable kind of thinking around those and would like to answer them.
And Luna gave a little bit of a story in the chat about that, about how some cishet guys responded when giving pronouns. And I guess the thing is that their reaction, while sometimes they can act in a way that is prone to try to act to embarrass you, really speaks to them. I know that's not always comforting, but the reality is that their insecurity, their lack of education and knowledge about that is what brings forth the reactions. And so if I can just, I don't know, just give you a sense of just stay true to yourself, stay safe, pick and choose the places, because the reality is, as much as one wants to be out and about, not every place always is safe, and your gut is going to tell you where that is. But saying that to those young people, it let them know that things aren't always the way, and somewhere along the way, they're going to keep hearing that and experiencing that and start to understand it. And eventually they will use those properly, but you don't change who you are just because of that reaction. So good for you for doing that, and they'll come around in time. I don't think that's much encouragement or sympathy, I don't know, but yeah, and it is little by little, it's starting to come there. Back to the question. So anybody want to say, like, school experiences, are any of your teachers using preferred pronouns or asking for those in classes? Anybody want to speak up about that? or even identifying themselves with their preferred pronouns?
Yeah, we see that a lot, Axel. We hear that a lot, that folks either don't ask for your pronouns or don't respect them. That's awesome, Luna. I'm so happy to hear that teacher is respecting your name and pronouns.
And it can go the other way too. There's kind of a wokeness going on. So don't be surprised. Teachers have been going to a lot of trainings where they might get into class and be like, okay, now we're all going to share our pronouns, because that can be just as scary. And what we tell them is, don't make people share. You can invite people to share, because it can work both ways. They don't respect the pronouns. I'm sorry to hear that, Axel. That's horrible. We'll keep working on them.
Yes, and one of the things, like Sue mentioned, one of the things that we do here at GLIS is we actually go into schools and talk to teachers and talk to educators who are not respecting folks, not just name and pronouns, but that is one of the issues that we do hear very consistently from our youth. So if it is any comfort in that as well, you are not alone. That happens very consistently, and it's one of the things that the staff here at GLIS is extremely passionate about advocating for y'all.
I love sending letters to principals and superintendents to invite them. So if any of you want to tell me about any names of schools that you'd like me to send a letter to, we're not calling anybody out, we're calling them in. So feel free, I'll be happy to send them a letter just to say, I'd like to let you know about some things we have at GLIS. They'll never know anybody told me about it in here, promise.
Thank you so much for adding that, Sue, too, because I get a lot of questions about, are they going to know it was me, or am I calling a person out, which is very uncomfortable, or may even potentially put you in an unsafe situation. We would never, ever do that. What we're here to do is recognize that there's a problem, and in our capacity with our resources as adults and as part of an agency and an organization, to use those resources just to educate people and let them know this is a problem for everyone. It doesn't matter if folks use a pronoun that doesn't align with whatever pronouns are assigned to you, or a pronoun, or your sex assigned at birth. This is something that's important for everyone, and misgendering and dead naming are forms of abuse, and they are not legal. They are not legal in New York State. So it's really, really important to us that we educate everyone, because that's just unacceptable. And we also want to make sure and understand that your safety and individual safety and confidentiality is our top priority as well. Okay, so we are out of time for today. We're going to transition to our next workshop, but Allie is going to put up, oh, thank you, Allie. Allie's going to put up our information. So if you have any questions at all, like Sue said, if you want to reach out to us and our staff, you can just go to our website, which is glysgy.org. And if you go to the staff tab, you can find each of our individual contact information and learn a little bit more about our programs and what we do. And we're always happy to help in any capacity that we can, even if you just need somebody to talk to, or if you're struggling with family or school or anything like that, or you just want to tell us about your experiences. We're always happy to listen and be there for y'all. So I just want to thank everybody so much for coming. And just remind you that if you have not filled out the registration form, you can do that. I've just put the link in the chat box again. And if you have not registered for our virtual diversity prom, which is going to be on June the 4th, you can do that at our Eventbrite link. So thanks everyone so much for coming, and thank you to our co-presenters who did such a great job putting this together at the last minute. And again, thank you everyone for being so engaged in the conversation and feeling safe enough to share all of your experiences with us. Bye.